Today, we're digging deeper into the ideas of deed and creed, action and belief. In the 19th century, progressive religion and what I'd call proto-humanism had the idea that groups should unite not around a creed, as many religious groups require, but around deeds or actions. This came to be summarized as deed, not creed. The idea of deed, not creed has been extended by some to apply to individual beliefs and actions, to say that what we do matters more than what we believe. And the phrase has sometimes been reworded deed beyond creed or deed over creed to recognize that beliefs may indeed matter, just not as much as action. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Go put your creed into the deed, nor speak with double tongue." And, he said, the thing done matters and not what is said about it. In contrast, Sam Harris, one of the four horsemen of New Atheism, wrote a few years ago that we should indeed judge people by their beliefs. He argued that every belief has predictable outcomes in actions. I'm Jone Johnson Lewis, a third-generation humanist, and for the last 30-plus years, an ethical culture leader and a Unitarian Universalist minister. Today, I'm talking with Hugh Taft-Morales, a member of the Washington Ethical Society. Hugh has served as the leader of both the Baltimore and Philadelphia Ethical Societies for over a decade. He's active in the work of the American Ethical Union and serves as secretary of the National Leaders Council. He's married with 3 adult children and lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland. So let's jump in. Hugh, what do you see as the relationship between deed and creed, or beliefs and actions?
Interesting you mentioned that Sam Harris quote about his slippery slope fear. And that's true, but it seems to me that one of the things that Felix Adler saw that led him to lead him to create ethical culture was that so many holy wars, et cetera, are fought over creed. And so I think whatever slippery slope arguments there are that beliefs are, quote, predictably going to lead to certain behaviors, I take that with a grain of salt. But I've always approached ethical culture through history, and you were my teacher for a lot of that. And I was intrigued when you mentioned that the term deed before creed and this vocabulary was part of the Unitarian circles of the mid and early 1800s, where I think a lot of ideas that I sort of embraced that led to the progressive movement began. So it always appealed to me. I don't think I could have joined a religious community where that was not front and center. I mean, the idea that how we act is more important than the beliefs we use to justify our actions seems almost like common sense to me. It's not that great of an insight, but it seems to me that that's obvious. One's philosophy is less important than how you treat others. I mean, that's kind of how I was raised to see the world. An example, like I'm personally an atheist. I don't need to prove to anybody that I'm an atheist. And also, I'd rather be in a world full of theists who treat each other well than a world full of atheists who don't. And I can't imagine being in a world full of atheists that don't treat each other well and think that that's a good world. But I'll admit, some of it also is that I'm sort of not interested in theological debates. So when you're talking about beliefs and you're talking about religious beliefs, they just don't interest me. I'm sort of an apatheist, right? I'm not really interested in claims about God. That said, I'll get into later about how important it is that we agree on certain beliefs when we construct, public policy, as an example. I think that's where it's important. But the one other thing that I'd want to add is that I sort of embrace a pluralism in the way I approach the world, and that there are many ways to live a good life and many ways to treat people well. And that was actually captured by the first leader of the Ethical Society in Philadelphia, S. Byrne Westons, who offered this advice. He said, quote, "There are many paths to right living. many roads leading towards the kingdom of heaven on earth. Ethical religion offers its way to such a goal. To follow it does not require committing oneself to or against any theological views. The essential thing is an ethical purpose. So that really appeals to me.
Yeah. So how do you think that shapes a progressive religious or an ethical culture society or Unitarian Universalist congregation to not focus on beliefs and to, in fact, have a diversity of beliefs?
Well, I think it's useful to sort of think about creating a garden where you're growing many sorts of crops to see what you need. So there's that benefit of pluralism. I think we need to have lots of laboratories to try out ways of seeing the world and see what fruit they bear. It's the seed of a pragmatic orientation, I think. So, you know, sometimes I think that my commitment to deed before creed is not a commitment to a belief in deed before creed.
Mm-hmm.
It's really just a commitment as opposed to a truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of progressive movements and progressive religions, whether it's UU or ethical culture, hold on to that. When I think about why ethical societies are vibrant, I think it's because we celebrate diversity and a diversity of thought. When we don't, I think we stagnate. So this allows us to nurture sort of experiences of humility and mystery and wonder. I mean, if you're in a diverse community, your own beliefs begin to seem less interesting than exploring the beliefs of others. And quite often they will support your belief. Sometimes it'll lead you to change it. And that, to me, is the basis of the pragmatic theory of truth and sort of formal academic philosophy, which I can get into, but I don't think is at the core of my sort of commitment to deed before creed.
Yeah. So for individuals, do you think deed is more important than creed?
Definitely. How you decide to live your life when you wake up each morning and how you spend your time is more important. I mean, obviously you're going to have ideas, but I guess maybe this is where I will get into the pragmatic philosophy. Beliefs are rules of thumb, or better metaphor would be beliefs are the map that we use to navigate through life. And those are contingent upon whether the map gets us where we want to get. Otherwise, we throw the map out or redo it or correct it. So as an individual, yeah, if I'm taking ibuprofen for a torn hamstring, as an example, and I find that it's giving me an upset stomach, then I'll change my belief that that's what I should take to a belief that I should take Tylenol. And so, yeah, for an individual, testing one's belief is very important, and it's liberating. It doesn't mean we're not chained to past beliefs, and I think it often also opens us up to the wonderful experiences of mystery, right? That we don't know. I mean, William James spoke at ethical societies, and I love the way he and and Dewey, who sort of was his predecessor, and Peirce, who came before him, thinking that things are best described by where they lead us. So wealth, for example, is not the dollars I have in my pocket. Wealth is what happens when I go to a store and I hand my dollars and get what I want. The exchange makes wealth. And you don't know whether it's going to be good until you do the exchange. If we end up falling into barbarism, then dollars are going to mean very little, and penicillin and bullets, unfortunately, will be worth more. So I think the same goes with health. Health isn't a static thing and can change at a moment's notice. So you're healthy if you want to do things, and then you can go do them. So yeah, for me as an individual, deeds are much more important than creeds.
So the Buddhists have as one of their central concepts the idea of right belief. Do you think that some beliefs are more likely to result in a society that is livable and in happy, more fulfilled lives?
Yes. I'm very
And which ones would you propose?
Yeah, I dabble in sort of westernized Buddhism a lot because it seems like it holds a lot of truths, as a lot of other worldviews do as well. But impermanence, the fact that everything is flux and our lives are transitory, the idea that our ego is not some substantial core that exists through time, but is more of a flow or even an illusion. I mean, I think you see those same elements in Stoicism, even in the Serenity Prayer that I heard my mother say, that we don't control the big picture, so you got to focus on what you can control. And I think that's at the heart of the Buddhist sort of embrace of impermanence. When you have a grasping attitude, I think that's when suffering arises more often. And it also leads you to close off your worldview. The gentleness in Buddhism, which isn't really an idea, but I think it's wrapped up in that impermanence, that if you really do appreciate that your life is fleeting, I think you're more gentle with the time you have and the people you interact with. And that kind of gentleness, I think, allows us to be more humble and open and less likely to be defending our turf because somehow, this is the inalterable truth that we have to defend. That said, I do think there's some ideas that have more truth than others, and I think impermanence is one of them.
How about within humanism or ethical culture? What do you see as some of the commonly held beliefs that seem to be more likely to lead to the good life?
Well, so to be clear, when you say which of the beliefs, I want to say there are certain commitments rather. I want to sort of switch out the word, because to say I commit to a belief begins to me to open up the potential that I'm going to defend this belief, as opposed to choose this path. So that Burns quote at the beginning is sort of, so the path I think leads to a more fulfilling life, for example, is to believe in the inherent worth of every person. The centerpiece in a lot of ways of ethical culture and a lot of progressive religions. Because in a way, if you really do commit to having that attitude, everybody you meet is an opportunity to experience connection and friendship and joy and wonder, as opposed to believing that everybody is out to get you, and it's a dog eat dog world. I mean, in some ways, I'd rather be guilty of occasional naivete than constant mistrust, which is a very difficult way to live a life. Given current events and the state of politics, it's an uphill battle to commit to belief in the inherent worth. But it's a little bit like doing a generosity meditation each morning. Just think of three things that you're not generosity, gratitude. Think of three things that you're grateful for. To commit to do that makes the world open up a little bit more and makes it better worth. But again, I wouldn't want to be a Pollyannish and say believe in the goodness of the world because this is the best of all possible worlds and so on and so forth. The world can be better for sure, but to commit to look for the light, especially the light in other people, that's, I think, worthwhile.
Yeah, you touched on this earlier a little bit, but do you think that there are some beliefs that are dangerous, to the kind of world you want to live in, the kind of life you think people can live?
Well, certainly the belief that truth is static and in the possession of a elite. I mean, that's probably the most common dangerous belief in all of the world. It's sometimes held sincerely by people, but quite often it's just a hypocritical stature to gain power. So I think that is dangerous. I do think that being suspicious of other people is dangerous to the degree that you develop a paranoid mindset. And I think there's a self-fulfilling prophecy there. I mean, to trust anybody is to open up and become more vulnerable. And I've talked many times about the philosopher Martha Nussbaum's book, The Fragility of Goodness, which I just adore because it really outlines how in the Greek myths, for example, the good people are people that can be broken. And the reason they can be broken is they care about many things. And when you care deeply about many things, quite often you're going to be hurt because those things are going to be hurt. But that offers an opportunity to live a meaningful life. And having children is probably the greatest vulnerability we have as parents, is to see them walk out into the world and to realize that they can be hurt. And but I can't imagine living a world where my children aren't out there in this dangerous world living fully. But that takes a lot of trust. If we lock everything inside a lockbox to keep it safe, that's corrosive of living a full life, I think.
Okay, so I want to get back to the idea that there might be a multiplicity of beliefs, that any of which could lead one down paths that are constructive and build that better world and better life that I think we want. If we have, I want to get back, and I also want to get back to this idea of the origin of that phrase in talking about group unity, that, the churches fought wars over beliefs like, is Jesus fully human and fully divine? And to say, we don't care about that, we care about behavior, ends up with a different kind of organization, wouldn't you say?
To embrace creed as more important than relationships and people, yes, leads you to an intolerant culture, a culture that wants to try to control how people think. Definitely.
So how do you think it works then to have a community, a group that's a community, but that doesn't share some common beliefs and that has that multiplicity of beliefs? How do they find their unity?
Well, I think it goes back to that agreement to a commitment. I mean, in ethical societies, I tell people, I don't want you to check your beliefs when you come in the door, but I want you to know what this community has decided is going to be our focus. So you can enjoy knitting, but if you come on to a meeting and demand that everybody knits, it's not that knitting is bad. It's that you've missed what the group has agreed upon. So I think groups can move forward by saying, this is what we're here for. This is what we're agreeing to. And if everybody wants to change that, we can discuss it. But until it gets to the point where the group decides to change the mission or the purpose, then this is what we're doing. So you can have lots of different beliefs. I mean, we have theists in ethical culture. We have atheists in ethical culture. But we're not about either of those positions. We're about, what do you do independent of those positions? So I think the way a community creates relationships, bonding, and unity is to come to agreement on what is the focus of this group. And it doesn't have to be what is the purpose of life. I think that's the other thing I think odd. I think, well, for example, when people ask me, to describe myself, personal identity statement, I sort of tell them, well, how long do I have? Because, I could say any of 1,000 things. I'd probably start with a father and husband, right? But once you begin to go out, there are thousands of things I am, and they can even be contradictory. They don't have to be consistent. I think that's actually an interesting point in Sarah Bakewell's new book on Humanly Possible. How one of the things about being human is that we're not always consistent, and that's okay. In a way, that's a little bit like having a garden where you're growing lots of different things. Here's the vegetable garden, here are the flowers. It doesn't have to be all one thing. So as a group comes together, if we can decide, well, we're coming together for X, Y, or Z reasons, who wants to be a part? Great. I don't know if you remember Ami Dar when he spoke at an Ethical Society annual assembly, where he talked about the fact that often liberal groups will say, okay, what are our priorities? And they spend an hour listing 300 of them, and then the next hour fighting about which ones are most important. And that doesn't seem a way to move forward. I think you can say, well, who wants to focus on X, Y, and Z? Why don't you come over here? And that's how groups form more organically around shared interests. I think what happens to institutions is they hold on to their mission with such tenacity that the interests have changed. And so then there becomes this infighting between people who are saying, but this is who we are. Well, we change. They're going back to impermanence. Groups should change too. And there are times where organizations, their mission is no longer of interest to people. And I think that that's okay. You asked what beliefs are dangerous. I think a category of beliefs that are dangerous that I mentioned earlier are beliefs that are absolute, certain, the concept of purity, that somehow everything has to be just right. Even consistency, I think, is a dangerous, overwrought consistency. How many times have I seen people try to apply rules that work inside a certain context, but then when they're not working, they continue to use those rules to try to achieve something when it's clearly at the expense of the individuals involved.
Yeah. So do you see there are any practical limits to the beliefs that can be held within a group like an ethical society and still have cohesion?
Definitely. I mean, I like the fact that ethical culture has a narrower focus in a way than, I'm not an expert, but I used a document you wrote about the difference between ethical culture and Unitarian Universalism. And Unitarian Universalism allows for people to explore their own spiritual path within a community. And that leads to a very diverse collection of folks. And it can work, but I think it's harder to keep that group cohesive than narrowing it to saying we're going to focus on the community and on the relationships and on a narrower range of beliefs. So just the pure number of things you're trying to do. And I think we see that today in ethical culture, where we really need to make a decision on what are the direction, what are the things we want to do, what are the projects we want to do that are going to be the core. We can't do it all. And we've got to let some things go. I mean, in the classic narrative about the United States, it was an experiment in diversity, e pluribus unum, right? And the fact that we have this plethora of people, backgrounds, beliefs, and yet we all commit to a certain ideal of how we interact. That's a wonderful model. I think ethical culture tries to model that. Perhaps that's slightly because Adler was so enamored by what he saw in the United States, escaping a repressive Germany where everybody was told they have to march in lockstep, leading to the harassment of his uncle, for example, jailed for labor activities because it was out of step, right? So I think there's a community can be more diverse than we think and yet still hold together, especially if you focus on the interpersonal sort of, I don't want to use the word rules. Manners is too light. There's something in between there that I'm not quite thinking. Sort of the way we interact with each other. I think the more you focus on that give and take, the greater the diversity can be.
Yeah. I'm wondering if we're getting into the area then of values being something that's not exactly belief, but has more of a need to have some consistency, or at least boundaries.
Values and boundaries as being something that, yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, because when I'm talking about ways of interacting, that's much closer to what values do you hold. I don't want to, I think it would be easy to reduce any value that I would describe into a belief and vice versa. So I don't want to sort of be too fine with this analysis. But if you value other people, that's more about, I think it's more about a commitment. I don't think you value anything just because you say it. I think you value something when you commit time and resources to it. There was an expression I used when I taught values clarification back in the 80s when that was an acceptable thing to do, where a value is something you value or desire and you act to protect or acquire. So you either desire it and you act to acquire it. So it is a consuming element, but I value fruit. Or you value it, or you admire it and you act to protect it. Other people, great works of art, nature, if you're acting. So the values, I think, imply a commitment in action. I think they're a little harder to detach from your behavior. You can say, oh, well, these are my values, but if you don't do it, it's just hypocritical. It's not really what your values are. So
it occurs to me that pluralism is itself a value.
Right.
And
right.
A community that has a commitment to pluralism might have a hard time being a home for somebody who didn't value pluralism.
Right. But I do think this actually reminds me of something that our wonderful colleague who died a couple of years ago, Richard Canary, would really focus on. I mean, he talked about, he said, in fact, in his his real statement of his beliefs that he put forward, he said, I start with deed before creed because I believe that the adage keeps us from being direct, that the adage keeps us from being direct in presenting our worldview. Sorry, let me say this again. He believed in deed before creed, but he thought that we went overboard. I think he was one person, and I think you've pointed this out too, that the phrase that Adler embraced was not, he didn't really mean deed, not creed.
Right.
He meant deed is more important than creed. So we do have a creed, and that's something that Richard said, and I agree. And I actually think the AU website has it wrong. I don't know if you know, on the American Ethical Union website is a statement under who we are. it has this quote. I'll actually read you the quote because I wish it would be changed. It says, "Does ethical humanism have a creed? No. We are not bound by any community, creed, or dogma. Rather, ethical societies emphasize the importance of developing a clear personal philosophy that makes your life understandable and meaningful."
Uh-huh.
Well, I'm all for throwing out dogma, which is unquestionable creed.
Hmm.
We are questioners, but to say we're not bound by any community creed, I think is simply wrong.
Hmm.
Our creed are the values that we state together that we commit to. That's
Hmm.
our creed, and they can change. Remarkably, they haven't changed much over 140 plus years of ethical culture, but I think that's because they are pretty much common sense. A commitment to the worth of others, a belief in social justice, which to me is just the universal commitment to the worth of others, and then a commitment to try to do that work through relationships.
Hmm.
Though I don't think those are creeds that you have to throw out. I think they're pretty tried and true as good ways to approach the world. So they've been around, and that those are the ideas that seem to be the agreement we come to when we get together in ethical
Hmm.
culture.
Yeah,
It
more
doesn't mean
agreements than creeds. So,
exactly, exactly. But I guess I look at creed as publicly stated values. That's it.
uh-huh.
And you can take those down and put up new ones. So
Hmm.
it might be a different way that people look at. I think some people look at creed and think of it as being close to dogma,
Hmm.
like the Nicene Creed is dogmatic in Christian
Right,
history. Right.
right. And of course, the word comes from credo, I believe. So, it has to do with um, the thought, uh, the ideas. Yeah.
Right.
Adler's original um, public advocacy of the phrase was in his founding address, where he worded it as diversity in the creed and unanimity in the deed. And I think I find unanimity in the deed itself is a bit of a pipe dream
Absolutely, Joan.
and gets us into trouble.
I agree 100%. I don't think we need unanimity about what deeds we think are primary.
Hmm.
I think it's good to strive for unanimity when we are working together.
Hmm.
I mean, if you're, so we might have many boats out there doing different things. When you're on the same boat and your goal is to get to a certain spot on the bank, you should be rowing in unison. I think
Uh-huh.
that unanimity is a good
Hmm.
thing. But
Yeah.
right, I agree with you. The idea that somehow we are going to be unanimous in our deed, full stop, is a
Hmm.
pipe dream. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. I've often worded it as solidarity in the deed, as we can support each other in our deeds, even if we're not actually doing it the same with each other.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you wanted to say on creed and deed that I forgot to ask about?
Well, as I said, I love the history in a lot of the work that I do, and the fact that ethical culture flowed out of Reform Judaism is important because I love the concept of tikkun olam, the healing of a broken world. That's the commitment that you take as somebody who's involved in Reform Judaism. And Adler was raised in that environment where it became almost, it was nurtured as a natural reaction to suffering.
Mhm.
I think it would be a lot easier for us to raise children if we do expose them to the difficulties of life and show them that actually in the presence of that they can make a difference. I don't think we do. I think we protect our young people
Mhm.
too often from the suffering of the world, and as a result it's sort of like we think we got to fill them up with creed, and then we set them out into the world and we say go do your deed. uh,
Mhm.
I love in ethical culture that the young people are out there doing things that they help decide is worth doing when they see suffering. So I think Jane Addams from one of our favorite books said something like that she was angry that her parents shielded her, and she said children too want to climb steep stairs and eat their bread with salt. The tears of every day are important. So I think the commitment to deed before creed has got to be something that starts very young, and it's outwardly focused. I think we are much too wrapped up in old Protestant overzealous concentration on the interior. If I were to have a birthday party for my child, and I bring out the cupcakes and I put them on the table, and my child reaches for the cupcake first, my mother, who sort of transferred some Calvinism into my early parenting, would have scolded the birthday child and slapped the hand or something, saying, "Don't be so selfish." Whereas after learning other parenting techniques, thank goodness, from teachers wiser than me, instead I'd say, "Oh, Sally, don't you think your guests would like to have a cupcake?" Offering the child an opportunity to get pleasure out of first offering the cupcakes to others. 90% of the time that works better and doesn't develop this self-loathing and connection to a sense of a lack of self-worth that I think contributes to a lot of bad behavior as they grow older. So,
yeah. As you say that example, I'm thinking that there's an underlying set of different beliefs there. And one that the belief that behavior changes because of external control, and the other that behavior comes from a flourishing from within,
right,
which
right,
might
exactly.
be prompted by something external. But there is a belief there.
And I get a lot of that when I came into philosophy through a lot of animal behavior studies. Jane Goodall, Mary Midgley wrote a book called Beast and Man, and when you look at animals and how dominant the altruistic, or at least the sympathetic, aspects are of their behavior, of course that's fairly universal. That there's a natural goodness that you can nurture. I remember when everybody sort of, when Jane Goodall suddenly saw the horrible behavior that occasionally came up in great ape communities, and people said, "Oh, look, see, your theory is proven false." And she said, "No, no, 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 no. It shows how much more they are like humans, that we're basically good creatures, and occasionally we can do horrible things."
Yeah.
There's one last point that you mentioned, Arthur, and actually one of the things that I got from Arthur was how much he stresses the importance of the uniqueness of every person. And that is a dominant truth. And if you really believe in the uniqueness, and that's something that Adler focused on a lot too, you have to allow people different ways to express their goodness. And that when you nurture their own goodness, when you bring out that best in them, that's when the relationships become mutually enhancing, I think. So I just think that's an important aspect too.
Well, thank you so much, Hugh, for being here today and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Jone.
And I want to thank those who are watching this video. You can check out the eManifold YouTube channel for more digging deeper into the ideas of humanist and progressive religious community.